Hi, my name is Jasmine Herrera and this is my video blog number 4. First, I'm going to talk about how and why the border symbolizes death and life. Well, the border symbolizes death because there's a lot of people that die in the process of crossing the border, and we see a little bit of this in the Cantu book, and how people would die in the desert because of the heat, because they didn't have any water, because they didn't have any food, because some of them were injured in the process or left behind because they were too slow. So in a way, this is one of the reasons why the border symbolizes death, because there's actual death in the process of crossing the border. And also, I discovered another meaning of how the border symbolizes death recently because of the caravan. I was really watching the news to see the updates of what was happening, and I came across one interview with one of the people that is traveling in the caravan, and he was talking about what it meant for him to cross the United States, because all these reporters were asking oh well, aren't you afraid because the United States is saying that they're not going to support this? And he said something really interesting, that so he basically said, for me, staying in my country means dead. So I'd rather die in the process than go back to my country and die of starvation and poverty. And I started to think about this fact, right, that we sometimes don't think about it. But yes, there's a possibility of them dying in the crossing, but there's also the possibility of them dying if they don't cross. And for example, here in Juarez, with the violence and everything, how a lot of people started to go away to live in El Paso, it's the same thing. They were escaping violence, and they were escaping all this really negative and toxic environment and poverty and all the drug thing that a lot of people were getting involved in. So for them, if you don't cross, that might mean death also. And when it comes to life, I think a lot of people see the positive side. If you don't die in the process of crossing, there's a possibility of having a better life. And I see these a lot with people that have young children. For example, in the caravan, they talk about well, it's not for me, it's for them, because I want to give them a better life, and it doesn't matter if, for example, if they deport me, if my kid is able to have more opportunities. And I think this is very important, because in this way, they're risking their life because they have this, even if it's a little hope, they have this hope of having a better life for them and for their kids. So that's how I think it symbolizes life. Also, I think the border is both romanticized and demonetized, because, well, I think it's romanticized by a lot of immigrants that come or that make the travel, because they do see that oh, I'm pursuing the American dream and everything is gonna be better there, I'm gonna earn dollars and there's gonna be a lot of improvement in my life. And I think that's a way of them romanticizing the border. But I think also people within the United States, some people believe that there's and some of it can be true, that there's not as much how can I say this? There's not as much racial difference in the border, because a lot of us have Mexican backgrounds and or are immigrants or first, second, third generation Mexican Americans, that there's more of a cohesion and not so much a division. And I think some of it is true, but there's still a lot of racism, and there's still a lot of other problems that we do have. And demonetize, well, I think in this aspect, and I can talk about for example, the Juarez side, the violence kind of stereotype, right? Because of all the drug smuggling and everything, there's this image of well, the border is really dangerous, and in Juarez is oh, it's it's almost like Las Vegas, right? The city of sin, and there's all this bad influence. And I think this relates a lot to El Paso and everything, because one of the reasons that there's a lot of drug trafficking is because of the crossing. It's because it's an easy access for them to cross all these things, because they don't stay here in Mexico. They go to El Paso. So I think that's one of the things that can be seen as something wrong. Also, there's the assumption of that the Mexican border can like have and how it does have like an impact on the Latinx community. I found this really interesting, and actually one of my peers in the Joan J mentioned it, especially with the administration right now. There's a belief that our immigrants that are from Latin America are Mexicans. So, and that's not the case. Like, there's people from Colombia and Peru and Costa Rica, Brazil. There's like a lot of Latinos out there. But because of the president went publicly and said like, oh, Mexicans are bringing hombres malos, bad hombres. It's like, oh, so they're all Mexican. And I think this is a negative, because saying that we're all Mexican, that's like kind of putting us all in the same plane, where there's a lot of diversity within the Latino community. And the culture from Venezuela or from Colombia, it's completely different from the culture from Mexico. And I think one of our peers in John Jay mentioned it, like, it's like, well, we don't really like to be called Mexicans because we're not Mexicans. Like, we are Colombian or we are from the Dominican Republic. And that kind of is like, I think that rhetoric can create some division. For us, it's weird because we are Mexicans, right? Like, we identify as that, but I do understand that people that come from different cultures within Latin America can find that problematic, because that's not their identity, and we're like just putting everyone in one clump. But like in the other side, I do think that within like the Latin community, there's a union that comes from being excluded, especially again in this administration, right? So if you're an immigrant, if you have an accent, if you have maybe like a darker complexion, that means that you're Latin, that you're foreign, and that you somehow don't belong. And I think in this sense, all the Latin like community and Latinx community kind of comes together because of our minority, and because we're like constantly being bombarded with this idea of like, you're a foreigner, you're a foreign alien, and you don't belong here. So that kind of brings us together a little bit. But I do believe there needs to be an understanding that the Latinx community is really broad, and we're not all Mexicans. Some of us are Mexicans, but not all of us. And I think it's important that people kind of understand and value that, because like every culture is completely different, and we need to be aware of that. Thank you.